Hi, good afternoon. My name is Isha Nelson. I'm a markets and economics reporter from Quartz. Thanks for joining us. I realize it's the last session of the day, so stay lively. And I'm sure we're going to have a really lively debate to keep you all engaged at the end of the day. So this panel is called From Analogue to Digital, a huge, broad, sweeping session that will be trying to cover a lot of things in, but I'm going to run through some of the things we're going to try and touch on. It gives you a chance to think about what questions you might want to ask later on today, towards the end of the session. So we'll be covering the transformation businesses go through in this process of becoming more digital. We'll be thinking about what that means for workers and their skills. I know the session before was on the future of work, so we'll be asking my esteemed panelists to discuss what's going on in their companies as well as what's going on kind of in general. We'll be discussing the role of governments in supporting this digital transformation, making sure that governments themselves don't lag behind in this process so that they can actually support the private sector sufficiently. And also, one of the really important things we'll be looking at how we can make sure this process is inclusive, not just innovative, that governments and the private sector work together to make sure that happens, an important topic for the OECD as well. And we'll also be thinking about trust in the digital economy, looking at, we've had so many data breaches, everyone thinks about data privacy and leaks and scandals, it's kind of covering the news at the moment. So asking who is responsible and what is that tension between governments and technology companies and making sure this process works. And so I'm going to basically go straight now to our panelists. I'll introduce everyone. Jonathan Aronson here. So he's Professor of Communication at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and the author of Digital DNA, Disruption and the Challenges for Global Governance. And let's have Nicola Hazel, the director of She Starts, which is an Australian program to support female entrepreneurs build tech businesses, as well as the head of diversity and impact at Blutely, another company that supports startups. We have Maury McFarker, the Director of Global Economic Policy at Google, former member of the Obama administration who worked on various senior capacities across global economics and finance. I have Enrique Medina Malo, the Chief Policy Officer at Telefonica. And last but not least, Richard Dobbs, a Senior Partner at McKinsey, and also the Director of McKinsey's Center for Government. So a lot of expertise in the room. And I think everyone almost has been in some way involved in both the private sector and the public sector, so no one can avoid any questions as they come around. I'm going to start off, Jonathan, with you, and I'm going to ask you if you could talk to us a little bit about the transformation that is going underway within businesses when they think about how they take that process. I'm sure many of us are used to working for very digital companies, feeling like that process is well underway, but I'm sure that's not the case actually all over the world at all.
Well, I've been given a time limit of, what, 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, we'll keep it
we're
short.
Doing it really focused and telescoped. Start with the now more or less accepted argument that information communication technology has led to significant disruption in both information and production companies. So this leads to and all of the factors that you've heard have been talked about. They keep changing. So the latest two that have been coming up a lot recently is AI and blockchain, which 2 years ago, not talked about. Today, everywhere in terms of that. That has forced disruptions not only in communications companies, but in all service industries, in manufacturing companies, and in agriculture and commodity companies. So that one of the things we do in the book as an example is to look at Monsanto Chemical Company, which may soon be a European company, but who knows? But what you see is the mining companies. Our president likes to talk a lot about, I'm going to put the coal workers back to work. However, if you talk to the coal companies, they say, oh yeah, we'd like to mine more coal. We have these great drones that will do it. We're not going to hire any of the coal workers back. They get killed and they get black lung disease, and it's really very ugly. So we don't want to do it that. We have accepted and embraced ICT in a way that is critical. Manufacturing companies, the number of lines of code in the latest Detroit automobiles and some of the European automobiles is greater than the number of code in the last version of the Boeing and jets. It's a computer. It is a whole information system that is embedded, and that's where the money is being made. So across the board, you can't find an industry that hasn't changed. Second point, this means inevitably that all national economies, from poor to very rich, is significantly different now than it was even 5 years ago. And the adaptation has to continue in order to be competitive. There just isn't any choice. That leads to the macro question that I'm dealing with. I'm a lowly academic, so I don't have the corporate insight, but I focus mostly on what do you do about policy? We don't have any global internet sense. What kinds of principles, norms, theories can we devise across national borders, and how do we make it happen? So what my colleague Peter Cowie from UCSD and I have been spending an awful lot of time on is trying to figure out a pathway forward. We look at consistently new issues that have not had to be dealt with before. The cloud. How do you make an international negotiation about the cloud where the data can be everywhere? About cybersecurity, much talked about. We actually look at the case of SWIFT, which has been remarkably successful over a long period of time in mostly maintaining its independence and mostly delivering money without too much problems. There have been 3 cases that we know of minor problems, and that's largely because somebody impersonated a sender and managed to basically counterfeit ID. But other than those, they're sending billions of dollars a day with remarkably little choice. And then, of course, what we have today is also privacy issues, which will be talked out, no doubt, later in this panel. So the goal is, how do you create a trusted digital environment which involves governments, experts, companies, and civil society to get something done?
Absolutely. Swift is one of those companies that is secretly kind of doing everything well, but isn't a sexy new tech company that everyone likes to talk about. Nicola, I want to ask you a little bit about this next point, which is when we think about more advanced technologies, whether that's AI, cloud computing, big data analytics, the OECD says that only 30% of firms across the countries that they look at actually are using these technologies already. What are some of the barriers from your experience working with new technology companies in kind of taking on these more advanced roles as opposed to kind of the first earlier waves of digital transformation?
Yeah, I think when we think about digital transformation and consider the opportunities for tech companies that are really just any company today, so there's the perception out there that tech is an industry, but in fact tech is every industry, and that is increasingly the case, how tech is infiltrating everything that we do. And there are therefore companies that are using technology to enable them to do what it is that they want to do, and they can do that from very simple ways, like e-commerce companies that have gone huge, the way of using digital content to really change the way that companies operate. But then when we look at where frontier tech is taking us, and all the way through to quantum computing, but what's happening with AI and ML, how do we actually make this more than a buzzword, where there are a few companies who truly understand and are exploring the potential of this, and then there are others who are saying, oh yeah, well, we'll just create an algorithm and we'll use AI and it'll just do this magic thing, but without really understanding the realities of what that means. So I think there is a huge gap between those two areas, and we have a lot of education to do to start to explore what that looks like. But we also do need to look at how the ethics of all of this occurs. And there's a growing conversation around AI in particular, which goes to the heart of how do we look at AI not as, you know, the sci-fi movies where the robots are coming and artificial intelligence is going to destroy the world because it'll get out of hand. Instead, thinking about how we put the humanity into creation of AI so that we actually utilize these shifts not just in terms of the way companies operate and firms operate, but in terms of the way we operate as a society, and build really a system that is going to drive better inclusion, better results, better humanity as a whole when we think about how these technologies can play that role.
Well, I mean, the robots haven't taken over yet, and history suggests that actually they might not, but one thing that can happen is greater inequality from having these changes. Maybe, Rory, you can talk to us a little bit about your role at Google and your previous roles in terms of how do you ensure that that change is inclusive, and who plays a part in making sure that happens?
I think it's a really, really important question. I think we're seeing around the world, on this side of the Atlantic, in the United States, and in many other parts of the world, just an extraordinarily high level of anxiety about technology, about the disruptive potential, about the idea that the jobs are going away, the idea that the robots are going to be owned by a few, and that the large bulk of our populations will be left with nothing. And so we've been trying to think through, both as a company but also in the larger political context, what is required to ensure that the benefits of these amazing technologies are shared essentially by everyone. And so, you know, we always start with our products. And so first and foremost, obviously, making products freely available, and then training people to use digital products, to have the basic digital skills that they need to get online, to find information, to find where they are on a map, and then if they have a small business, to be able to, for small amounts of money, to advertise in a very targeted way, which will allow them potentially to find customers and to get to scale. So we think very hard about how to share these benefits. There's, for us, you know, we think very much in terms of giving people access through skills, and also potentially giving people access in places where internet is hard to get. So you may have heard we have a experimental project in a different part of our company that is looking at whether you can deliver internet to far-flung regions by balloon, which sounds outlandish. It just turns out that if you have a lot of balloons and you are studying wind patterns, you can actually get a relatively stable delivery of internet. And we've experimented with that in Peru, and it's surprisingly, I think, successful. So that's the kind of thing that we do in our own products to ensure that there is very broad access. But there's only so much that companies themselves can do in this space. There is going to be a role for public policy. And so in a set of areas. So first of all, clearly, the education system needs to evolve with the times. I was reading a sarcastic remark from a school kid saying the exams that he had to take were, imagine there's no Google, and then ask the question. You know, it's like that there's so many factual questions that are easily answerable by contemporary technology that you just don't need to memorize. But at the same time, what you really need to learn in school and then subsequently is how to learn, how to continue to learn. You need the basic tools to be able to reinvent yourself throughout your career. And so, we as a company can fund, and we do fund, experimental NGOs that are looking at different ways of tweaking both the current education system and then re-education programs. But ultimately, to take these to scale, it has to be done by governments. A second area is access, including access in, that's a sociological issue, but it's also a geographical issue, going to far-flung regions, but making sure that women and poorer people and people from all parts of society actually have internet access. And finally, a basic issue is not erecting barriers, national barriers, subnational barriers that may be well-intentioned, may be inspired by a desire to protect current jobs and to protect current industries, but ultimately are only going to cause your country or region to miss the boat on some of these technologies.
That might be a good opportunity to pause and do our poll question. So there is a question for you, the audience, which is, what's the best way governments can help laggard firms catch up to better performing companies in the digital transformation? And you have three options: strengthen the competitive environment, boost business dynamism, and enable resource reallocation. On your chairs, I believe, is information about how you respond to the question. So we'll leave that up for a few moments and give everyone a chance to log on and answer that and see where we get to. In the meantime, Enrique, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about Telefonica. Obviously, you've literally gone through the process of going from analog to digital. Mm-hmm. What are your kind of recommendations, I guess, for doing that? You've been at the company for a while, so you've seen this process happen.
Yes, we've gone through that transformation. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having us here, and thank you to the OECD for having us in and allow us to participate in this exciting panel. So basically, yes, we've gone through that transformation. Telefonica is a company about to turn 90. So you can imagine, we had to go from analog to digital, although we've been managing communications of people throughout all these years, but that wasn't enough. There's many different ways nowadays to provide communication services, and clearly we are not the only ones anymore. We've gone through the process of losing the advantages and of being a monopoly. Obviously, we are still paying for that, but anyway, we need to transform and to make ourselves different animals. Basically, how we see and what we want to do is we want to promote in as much as we can a human-centric digitalization, and that in order to do that, there are 4 pillars that we think are basic in order to tackle that goal. First one for us is the underlying infrastructure. I mean, you can talk about products and services, and you can talk about experimental infrastructure, but at the end of the day, it's only telecommunications, it's the wires, the cables, and the base stations which make all this happen. And we have a real challenge there, but it's an exciting one, which is, after all this time, there's still half of the population not connected in the world, and we need to solve that. Of course, that has forced companies like Telefonica to change their mindset. We want to get as far as we can. Clearly, I mean, if car manufacturers had the challenge of that everybody should have a car, I think that should not be a threat. That should be, a great reason for joy in the owners of those companies. Well, now society is saying everybody needs to have access to the internet and to the digital life and to the digital experience. But we cannot do it alone. So we've had to innovate. That is why we're working with companies that are normally our nemesis, like Google, for example, in the project, in the Loom project, and more intensively now with other, very big internet giants like Facebook, and taking our experience of internet for all. So that's the first one. The second one is you know, there are social issues there. And we need to pay, to have our part there. You know, it's not about the jobs of the future. It's also how jobs are transforming today. So today, to become entrepreneur is as easy as having a backpack that somebody gives you and a bicycle, and you organize yourself, being working or not working for Deliveroo. But we need to see what kind of what is going to happen when these guys have an accident. What kind of protection do they get? And that's today. That's not tomorrow or robots. That's a guy in a bicycle. So then also we need to tackle the issue of the contributions to the countries where we play, where we work. And that's also an issue that you know, the OECD is working very hard on it. How the rights in the digital world are going to be treated, and especially privacy. I've heard that digital transformation means privacy does no longer exist. Do we want to accept that? When will it come then? Will they come then for another fundamental right, freedom of expression? That's another thing we need to tackle. And finally, and that's, I think, the principles of responsibility and accountability need to be there. You know, you hear sometimes, you know, well, you know, I just program the algorithm and then it works by itself. In a world of connected cars, you know, algorithms will have to have some ethics inside. And I know all this, we are all working on that, because when a connected car fails, and it will happen, we're in a situation where, you know, there's no way but rolling rolling on a pedestrian. Maybe it's an old guy and a child, and what do you decide? It's a very stupid example, but it's going to happen sometime. And you know, these rocket engineers are so clever that they know how to make this algorithm work and make decisions. So all that will take us to what we say it's smart policies. Those policies need to start to be deciding now in order to have solutions for the future.
You've covered a lot of things there, and we're definitely going to go back to some more of those in more depth. But I was going to go to the answer to this poll, which is almost an even split between strengthen the competitive environment and enable resource reallocation. But we've just heard here about how Telefonica and Google are working together and how more and more big companies are having to work together. And maybe, Richard, you can talk to us a little bit about if the answer from the audience is that governments need to help increase competition, but we're hearing from big companies how they're actually working together. What do governments need to be doing?
Well, first of all, I think there's going to be a lot more competition. We've had a wonderful 30 years for businesses, and actually the competitive intensity has not been that high. And the reason we think competitive intensity is going to get much worse is there's going to be a number of factors. First of all, the rise of emerging market companies, where we're going to find half of the companies in the world are from emerging markets, and they're going to be much more ferocious on competitive intensity. Secondly, the rise of tech and tech-enabled businesses stepping out, disrupting other industries. That's going to be a big source of disruption. Our rule of thumb is a tech-enabled company typically destroys 5 times the profitability in the sector they disrupt than they create for themselves. So that's going to be a big thing. And thirdly, and this is the good news story, is we're going to see the rise of small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to be able to compete now in ways they couldn't. And to give a specific example, I bought some seeds for my garden the other day, and I bought them on Amazon Marketplace, I discovered actually afterwards. And I thought they were cheap because they were £1 for 20,000 seeds. When they arrived, I actually realized the seeds I bought was from an SME in China. That SME in China sits on Amazon Marketplace and sells around the world. They sell the seeds, and I did a little bit of benchmarking afterwards. They were selling at £1 a packet for 20,000. A British seed manufacturer on Amazon was selling at £3, and my local garden centre was selling it at £5. This SME 10 years ago could not have competed with all these other people, but they were able to compete today because they sit on Amazon Marketplace, and even though they didn't have global scale, they're able to operate as a multinational by selling around the world. So there is a good news story about a bunch of some of these tech-enabled things, is it's going to allow higher competitive intensity, but at the same time it's also going to allow some of these SMEs that couldn't compete to be able to compete. And I think that that's going to be part of the good news story. There is a bad news aspect to the story as well, though, is we think it's bad in terms of competitive intensity at the corporate level. the people who have it really hard are going to be governments. And governments are going to face this problem that an economy is not going to be working for a chunk of the population. Currently, we think 70% of people in the developed world are worse off than people like them the previous generation. Now, that's the financial crisis, and when that works through, we think it'll be 30 or 40% of people.
And you mean worse off economically or in personal well-being?
I mean, you know, you can go through different measures, but if you look at economically, you know, other things like, you know, life expectancy, there are pockets in the US now where life expectancy is beginning to fall. So, you know, you can see in different areas of that. And in the developing world, the classic path the countries have been through of export-led manufacturing is going to shut down. When you have robots doing the manufacturing, they're not going to be the jobs you can urbanize in these developing worlds. So we're going to be in a position where the economy is not working. At the same time, governments are not going to be working, hitting expectations. People are going to say, I can download an Uber app, I can be in an Uber car within 15 minutes. Why does it take me all weekend to do my tax return? Or why does it take me 2 weeks before I can see my GP, my doctor? You know, people are going to say government's not delivering it in line with our expectations for those governments that provide the health system. Now, that's the bad news. The good news for governments is actually the types of things that are causing these disruptions, particularly technology, could also allow governments to deliver outstanding performance. But they don't have the ability to apply this. So when we did a survey of governments about transformations in general, 80% of them said their transformations failed to hit what they were trying to do. This is not a muscle governments have to be able to transform themselves.
So I want to continue on that point about governments and where they can go to next.
In what part?
Oh, Rory, sorry.
Just one perhaps silver lining to that dark cloud that we just heard on the outlook for governments is that I think one challenge that the governments have faced in technological procurement over the last few decades is that, you know, the procurement cycle is long, the specifications change, governments will buy a massive system once every 10 years, it will be already 5 years out of date by the time it's delivered, and now with cloud computing, a lot of those issues really go away. The government can, on a continuous basis, have the latest software available to them. They don't have to invest their own dollars in physical servers. They can procure them. Obviously, governments need a whole set of special specifications on cybersecurity, on data protection, and so on. But nonetheless, this is, you know, potentially a really transformative innovation for the kinds of difficulties that governments have had historically.
And do we have examples of governments doing this well, or is this very much in theory, this technology is available?
You know, if you take some examples, I mean, in preparation for this panel, it was said, you know, you know, all my alarms go off when I heard the phrase level playing field, and I think it sometimes has been very badly understood. Let me give you an example. I gave you the example first of Deliveroo, and there's regulation there. We have today, as we are talking, we have a court order in one of the countries that we operate, ordering us to, you know, a judge ordering us to disconnect the Uber application. This 10 years ago, whatever judge would come to Telefonica and say, do this, you do it. But now, you know what is going to happen? The problem is not for Uber. The problem is for Telefonica and the rest of the operators in that country that will need to disconnect. Who will the customers call to? They're going to call us. Who will they complain to? They're going to be complaining to us. And the company who has the problems, which I don't want to go in or out, you know, there will be the poor guys that, you know, are forced to be out of the market, you know, regardless of the real situation on which basis they are operating. And I don't enter in that discussion. So, but you see how challenges, and that is why, you know, the issue of responsibility and accountability is important also for companies operating in this new world.
There's also an interesting connection between when we think about the discussion on government transformation and government's willingness to prepare for a very different kind of policy framework for this digital world that we live in, and a connection between that and the conversation here about SMEs and the role that we're seeing of more of these companies that are suddenly enabled to go and participate in a global marketplace in a way that they weren't previously. The question, though, is, in which cases? Because there are still many cases where the bare concept of anyone can start a small business, and if they have a product to sell, they can deliver it all over the world because technology makes it possible. But what happens if the infrastructure within their country prevents this from happening? This is a conversation I had with an entrepreneur from the Philippines who said that, yes, e-commerce is huge in the Philippines. Use of mobile phones is huge. However, logistics of actually manufacturing something and getting it out of that country, let alone getting it across the multiple islands in their region, mean that they still end up mostly producing just for their own local communities and for a very sort of a micro enterprise kind of model. So the idea that the internet makes it possible for any business in the world to sell any product to anyone in the world can still be immensely restricted, not by the digital technologies, but by the hard infrastructure and the government investment in hard infrastructure on the ground. And even in a country like Australia, a very developed nation with a very healthy economy, the divide between access to infrastructure in an immensely dispersed geography such as our nation, one that is huge but yet has a very small population, means that it is not equal access to entrepreneurship. There is not equal access to opportunity, and governments need to be thinking about how do we go beyond just the technology, but all of the other layers of infrastructure that make this huge transformation possible and indeed accessible for people.
2 points on this. One is that different countries and different regions are going to solve problems in different ways. What we need to do internationally is get some standards of what kinds of principles do we want. How that principle is going to be put into place is going to differ from place to place. And to expect a uniform implementation is just not going to happen. A second point in terms of this is what we've seen is great progress towards interoperability, but there's always going to be people who are going to try and block it, companies are going to block it. We were talking about this before. Established players tend not to simply welcome the would-be competitors into their midst. And one of the roles for government is to make sure, not that the playing field is absolutely fair, but that there is going to be an opportunity for somebody who has a better idea in software, in programming, in hardware, to be able to sell their innovation, because that's what ultimately levels, makes it possible for emerging markets to compete well. Sort of your point, Richard.
Two examples of successful IT transformations from the UK. One was the Vehicle Licensing Authority. It used to be massively painful to apply for your vehicle license. You had to go along and queue up, and you had to take all these bits of paper, and most people didn't have every bit of paper when they went along to the post office and stood in line, and it was a very painful process. They did a re-engineering. It wasn't the type of Rory talked about in terms of, small, it was a big IT system, but they got it right. And, people now can go on and you can get your driving license. It pulls the data from the Home Office Passport Agency, bit of there, and you can get your driving license set up in less than 5 minutes. And there is a web survey that asks you what your experience is, and you get 95% satisfaction. People are just saying, this is as good an experience as dealing with Amazon or Apple. That's one example. That was a big IT program. But my favorite one is actually a small one. It's a company called Babylon that produces an app that allows you to do your GP effectively over the internet. So I can go in here and I can make an appointment and I can see my GP video conference. I could book one tonight at 7:30. This is an NHS GP, so paid for by the UK government. I can get an appointment this evening. It'll be a video conference over here. He may have to I may have to go and see him, but in most cases they can do it all over here. He can send the prescription to my local pharmacy and I can go pick it up. Think about that. This is an app. It's sort of Uber-type technology that can exist on a series of smartphones, no big servers. You know, the largest big IT project the NHS cancelled cost them 700 million before they wrote it off. So, you know, here is an app that actually sits on a phone and can deliver that. And I think it's fantastic. And this is a small and medium-sized enterprise, they're probably now no longer quite so small, that has developed this. And they developed the technology, and they found ways of doing it without the big servers. And it is an app, so you can do incremental updates, and it's got an AI system that will start doing diagnosis. It's not yet there, but it'll start doing diagnosis using questions as well in terms of that. Now, that type of technology allows a small company to be able to help a government deliver in a way that is extraordinarily good for citizens' experience and also for productivity. It delivers both benefits.
Telehealth's a really interesting example of this in terms of the way that what is happening in private enterprise is integrating with, you know, social services and traditionally government-funded services. We have a startup in our program in Australia, in our alumni, a female-led business, a 13-year veterinarian, you know, had spent most of her life working in veterinary clinics and was frustrated with the fact that so many pets either didn't come in, or when they did, they came in too late or unnecessarily to a clinic at a high cost to the health of the animal, but also to the lifestyle of the pet owner. Created what was at the time the first online veterinary service in Australia, providing veterinary consultations and chats. That's a company called VetChat. The challenge for her wasn't whether the technology worked. The challenge is about the incumbency of a broader industry. And so when we look at telehealth generally, the question is not, can the technology work? Can we actually make it better and more useful for consumers? Can we create something to fill those gaps in the system? That's all possible and proven by entrepreneurs every day. The challenge is cultural and mindset. So in this case, the challenge is ensuring that an industry or a sector in terms of veterinary services actually feels comfortable recognizing that veterinary services could be provided in a way that is different to the way they've been provided in the past, that it is actually okay to get online and have a chat to your vet and find out what you can do to make your pet healthy in that moment versus having to go into a bricks and mortar clinic. And so it's cultural and mindset challenges that in many cases prevent progress. And the adoption of new technical ways of delivering services. The vet isn't cut out of this picture. It's not suddenly a robot vet telling you what to do.
I think that's
just a different
important point with the fact that a lot of these digital services don't mean removing the people. Actually, what people expect is more personalized services and making sure you can have those. And actually, that is a kind of a segue I want to make back to this point about skills and workers and talk about education and thinking about the fact that if we have to have this lifelong learning, which is a phrase that this gets thrown out there all the time, but I want to ask, like, what does that actually mean? And how can people be sure that they're getting that? Is it on the individual to anticipate what skill they might need next? Is it on the company? What are the government's roles in doing this? I mean, it'd be great if everyone kind of intuitively knew what skill they needed to learn next, learned it in their old job and was ready to spring straight into the new thing that comes up. But we've seen that that is not what's happening, and people end up, as these shifts happening, kind of falling out of the workforce and struggling to get back in. I know Google is part of trying to think about how you can train people, making sure those credentials are available. But I'd like to put this kind of question to everyone thinking about governments and what they should be doing to ensure this process is smoother, and what companies and individuals are able to do without putting all of the weight on them.
To give perhaps a slightly lighthearted answer to that question. One form of lifelong learning that we don't necessarily think of in that category is how-to videos on YouTube. So twice a year, I am called upon by my family to cook and then carve a turkey. And This doesn't come naturally to me. I never learned this in school. I don't have the basic skill set, but it is amazing how much you can learn by watching someone do exactly the task that you're being asked to perform, and then on the spot, you repeat each step. And you know, this is actually, so we have 500 million daily views of how-to videos. And they're not all on that level. There are, you know, very serious, essentially you can get the entire curriculum of MIT down, you know, you can learn advanced calculus. We ourselves have made available a machine learning crash course so that you, with, you know, if you do have a pretty solid basis in computer science, you can learn to use machine learning tools and become essentially an AI specialist. So these are, you know, that is a very real form of lifelong learning. Now, that's for, you know, that's going to be applicable for, you know, maybe for plumbing, maybe for cooking, maybe, you know, it's certainly not going to answer the challenge of, you know, the auto factory that closed, a bunch of, you know, men in their, you know, in their 50s who really are trying to figure out what to do in the next stage of their life. There is, you know, that is a much more complex problem. It clearly involves social policy, involves thinking through the design of social safety nets so that they do give people some, you know, amount of financial freedom to learn a skill, and does help them to figure out what they should be learning to do. It's a very complex problem. It's something that, you know, business and government need to work together on. But, you know, some of these tools can actually be powerful in helping that.
Julie, Nicola, and then Richard.
So when we talk about these skills, and there are the skills that you can learn on a how-to video, and our company Blue Chili has an online course called Startup U that allows people to access a lot of the concepts of entrepreneurship and how to really avoid a lot of the risks that happen in starting a tech company, and you can learn that online, and it's free. So these things are accessible for anyone, right? Education is available to anyone with the internet. The question is, though, at the different points in somebody's life cycle, at the different points in their career, are they able to have the skill set to learn new skills? So the skills for a job or for a task, how to carve a turkey, how to start a business, how to do anything, how to set up your new telephone, might be available online. But do we have an investment in developing the mindsets of current and future generations that will enable them to transfer themselves as individuals into these new skills and into these new jobs? So the skill set that we should be looking at from a broader policy framework and from an education framework needs to be looking beyond just individual technical skills, but indeed to skills around creativity, teamwork, storytelling, the ability to problem solve, that ability to collaborate with others, and to have literacy in financials and in digital that enable us to then know how to get onto YouTube and go and watch how to carve a turkey and then communicate how they learned how to carve a turkey to get a job as a chef, because there's a new job going in hospitality and their old job just got automated. You know, it's that skill set, that toolkit that is more important for us to be investing in than an individual skill or a list that we can tick a box for any generation.
But I think it's interesting how quickly the conversation around what those skills has changed. It wasn't so long ago the governments were kind of pushing everyone towards STEM subjects, and there was this panic that people wouldn't have the scientific and numerical literacy that they needed. But at the same time, we're now saying, actually, hold on, we also need you to have the creativity, we need you to have really good interpersonal skills, and I think it gets kind of complicated when
people are backflipping on this still. You know, some governments are still very focused purely on STEM education without those transferable skill sets to apply that STEM education. I think there is a broader conversation here that is ongoing in this space.
Richard, I kind of cut you off.
I think the first step actually, well, the first bit is actually take a bit of a step back. We need to have a better dialogue about what's about to happen. We are about to go through a bigger industrial revolution in terms of jobs disappearing than we had in Britain in the first half, 1800, 1850, US 1850 to 1900. That was a huge shock on both societies. And we are about to go through this, and there's a substantial period of retraining required, and we need to have that dialogue. And I think there is a point here where political leaders have to have this, and it's very easy for political leaders to say it's all about China or the immigrants, where actually you're missing the really big thing that's about to happen. So we have to have a higher quality dialogue than we're currently doing, because only by having people start engaging on how we do that are we going to be in a position to get the retraining happening at the scale we need to have. I think Rory's absolutely right about safety nets. If people are in a major panic going into this, they're not going to learn. You don't learn when you're very insecure, So we've got to have a conversation about the safety nets. And then we need to think about who are going to be the key people in retraining. And yes, we can do education, we can do online or whatever, but I think there's got to also be a thoughtful question about how do we get companies to retrain. If we look over the last 30, 50 years, companies have played a big role in building people's capabilities. And we have to think about what the apprentice program is. For instance, everyone thinks about apprentices. You think about someone who's under 20. Well, British Gas in the UK now will take apprentices up to 55. And we need to say, what is the 55-year-old apprentice program? And how do companies play that? And I think there's also a role as well. It's not just about the skills, it's also about aspiration setting. So people say, I'm going to set up my own company. I'm going to set up a taxi business, or I'm going to set up something. How do you help them set an aspiration? And one of the things some of my colleagues in the UK have been doing is some research where a tool which allows you to say, how good is my company? Are my costs in line with what they should be? Some benchmarking a small business can do. Because it's not just about training skills, it's also about how you set aspirations and targets. But I think we've got to start by having this proper dialogue, because if we don't have this dialogue, this thing that's going to hit us, which resulted in history, the creation of Marxism and the First World War and all these other things is going to happen. And at the moment, it's very easy for politicians to say it's China and the immigrants, but not actually then have the difficult conversation.
Let me throw in a different issue, which is a little, I'm not sure what to make of it, but it's not in the retraining, but in the training. I had a very surprising conversation with a very senior doctor at one of the top medical schools in the United States recently. And she said to me that she was having a real problem with the new medical students, that they simply did not know enough and did not have the study skills that those 10 years before. That it may be search, it may be that they didn't do as much homework, it may be that they simply didn't memorize things because they didn't have to. But she was very, very concerned. I didn't know how to take that, and I would be sort of curious whether anybody has been thinking about that kind of issue.
I think, Rory, that might be a question for you as well, and then Enrique.
Can I go back to one thing? Because, I mean, we are all given as granted that all those people that you're describing, all that training, all that skill, is for people that are already connected. Babylonia or Babylon only works for people already connected. But as I said before, so I mean, what we are finding in some of the experience we are doing, I mean, so we have a real threat, which is leaving a lot of people behind, a lot of people behind. And that, if you just put it from a business perspective, it's a huge mistake. I mean, because there's a lot of potential customers of all kinds on that, people that are not connected. So that is why we are doing some experiences, as I said before. But one of the things we found we need to train is people training on the infrastructure. Because if we are to send ours to some, remote places with not a lot of people, our own engineers and things like that, we will never build nothing. But we've seen that we have the possibility of training people in just, the maintenance and of a very basic network. Or maybe, recovering the looms and give us a call. And it's going to happen, because otherwise, you have to send a ton of Google engineers to recover the looms or maybe stitch them or whatever it has to be done. It will not work. So that training also, that training is for the access. That training is for being connected. And for us, we've seen in a lot of places, and in that effort that we have in order to make, connectivity available for all and internet for all, that training for us, it's essential. We cannot forget that we need to think that a lot of people have still not access to that.
Roy, I haven't forgotten that Jonathan had a question for you.
Well, I think there are two dimensions to the issue that Jonathan raised. One is how the skills that we need for different professions are going to change. And so in the medical realm, this is, I think a quite serious area of discussion now, because, for example, historically, if you were training to be a radiologist, a large amount of your time was spent staring at scans of, for example, of a brain or a lung or whatever, looking for cancers. And now it turns out that machine learning can actually do that at a very high level of accuracy. And that is, a fantastic development, because it frees up radiologists to do everything else that radiologists do, namely helping patients and prescribing and helping them work through their condition. But it does change what the training has to look like. Now, that said, the second dimension of your question is something that we as a company have also started to spend a lot of time thinking about, which is how do people, including children, interact with technology, and in what ways is that healthy or not healthy? And that's obviously an incredibly complex question, and not one that we alone certainly can answer. But we've started to, for example, introduce tools that allow you to know how much time you're spending on your phone, and allows you to pre-commit to your phone going to a less attractive grayscale when you've told it that you want to actually go to sleep, so that you don't spend all night playing games or watching videos. So we're starting to think about this kind of tech addiction problem, which it may, I think that is going to be a broader conversation for psychologists and for just more broadly in our society, about whether there are times when we are too plugged in, where we spend too much time online, and certainly that's a possibility.
Before we go to kind of stay on that topic, I wanted to ask one other thing, which is about productivity. Obviously, one of the great promises of a digital revolution is this boom in productivity, which many economists say they can't actually see happening. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think is stopping this. Is this one of the things I think a lot of you have described, is this sense of digital changes happening on kind of shoddy infrastructure, essentially, trying to create a lot of amazing products and being able to offer very specific services, but not being able to offer them to enough people, not being able to offer them across borders, just not being able to get those products out there. So is that kind of one of the ways that we can maybe, if we're thinking about what we want to recommend to governments, to companies, that level of actually taking a step back? Richard.
The first thing on productivity is people often confuse productivity and efficiency. So you can do a huge step in efficiency, and digital is definitely producing efficiency improvements. But if then the competitive intensity bids that away and the companies don't create that in value added, often you won't see it in the productivity numbers. So part of what we're having is we are having a massive step up in efficiency as a result of digital, but we're also having a big bidding away, and it's becoming a consumer surplus. And the way we measure consumer surplus is completely wrong. I mean, no one knows how to include search in the deflator, because it wasn't part of the consumer basket 10 years ago. The fact that we've had, or 30 years ago, it was never been part of the consumer basket. So we have all of this free search coming in. So I think there's a question on our measurement issue here on productivity and all of that we need to do. I think there is, though, a diffusion of best practice that we are not very good at. You know, the large companies in many cases are quite good at it, but even those are a long way off best practice. And the small and medium-sized enterprises, in many cases, don't have the ability to access the best technology. Or they have access to it, but they don't have the managerial capabilities to be able to apply it. In the same way as governments have access to all of this good technology. But you look at the senior people in government, they have never done an implementation program at the scale they need to do it. And implementations, you can't get the way there intellectually to how to do it. You have to have had the experience in doing that. So there is an issue about how we build people's capabilities to apply them, both in the SME sector and in the government sector in doing that. But we also need to be a bit careful on the premise that there hasn't been a big benefit, because there has been a benefit. It's been more an efficiency benefit that resulted in massive consumer surplus, but not necessarily GDP.
What you also get is the economists, and I apologize for the academic stuff, have a term for this, which is called the productivity paradox. And quite simply what it says is you really don't get the big benefits until you're 90% through with the investment. So the issue after issue this has happened. You've asked for examples, so I'll give you one. The ATM, for the first 10 years, the only people who made any money from ATMs were the people who made ATMs. The banks made nothing. Finally, Citibank managed to really perfect it, and there was a huge change, and the productivity jumped substantially.
I mean, we can see this in any implementation of new technologies, right down to the very micro examples of, video conferencing. I work in a tech company, a company that helps other entrepreneurs build tech companies, and probably talking to efficiency, one of the things that causes the most disruption in our week is when the Zoom link fails for a conference with a bunch of people in different places around the world.
Every day.
Every day, right? And this kind of inefficiency, though, the one option is to say, oh, well, let's just stop doing this, or let's stop employing people in different locations and just only employ a bunch of people who can sit in a physical room together.
Or switch to Google Hangouts.
Oh, well, hey, I do use Google Hangouts every time I talk to Google. But there are ways that you can just avoid the problem, or there are ways that you can keep working at solving the problem or trying new technologies. And that is enabling us to get past the obstacles to actually find those efficiencies, but then also enable that to, at a bigger picture, drive greater productivity. Change is hard, right? And if we're talking about going from analog to digital, this is significantly challenging change at a macro level for governments, at an individual level for large corporations, and for small corporations. In a company of 40 people, we're constantly changing. We change our model. We find that a group of startups that apply to one accelerator program at the start of the year are more interested in using a certain type of technology, and then the next year there are more applying who want to build technology integrating AI. Blockchain increases 1 year later. It's easier for us to adapt as a small company than it is for large companies and large governments who have an existing workforce geared towards a current status quo. But you have to keep pushing around that and thinking about and we talked about this before the panel, not what do we need to do in a policy framework for next year, but what do we need to do for the next 30 years? Because if large corporations and governments are going to take longer to adapt to change because they are naturally risk averse and they need to be so, then what are they thinking about in terms of the next horizon? Their horizon needs to be a lot longer, and even the small companies, the startups, are starting thinking with a deeper horizon themselves because they know that they won't be relevant and they won't survive to their next, their next investment round if they're not thinking much further into the future.
I mean, so basically, I think that the panel has brought out the two classic answers to this paradox of productivity, which is, on the one hand, it's certainly true that GDP statistics were not designed to capture free goods at all, free services. They don't. I mean, the wonderful example of the camera. So it turns out that in the year 2000, people took around 80 billion photographs a year around the world. And we know that because these were film, and there were only 3 companies producing film, and they cost about 50 cents each photograph. And Last year, at the best estimate, people took around 1.6 trillion photographs, so a factor of 20 more, and you know, they were free. So huge decline in GDP, which is ludicrous, right? But that's just the way we count, and so we should think about counting differently. But then I think that Jonathan's point is also very important, which is, you know, the other thing that we know from economic history is that the process of actually obtaining the real efficiency gains and productivity gains, I may be misusing these, but from technology, it's not at the first stage where you get the kind of low-hanging, easy, you know, take your Uber to work as opposed to driving. It's when you have discovered that you can actually completely reorganize your entire production process because, you know, cloud computing or AI, ML enable you to do things that you just didn't realize you could do, and enables you not to do things that you thought you had to do. And those kinds of gains are probably going to take some time to disseminate. They may only disseminate, well, they may primarily disseminate in new companies rather than old companies. It's harder for old companies to reinvent themselves. Obviously, you know, I think there are some very strong examples of European companies who are doing a great job of trying to introduce new technologies throughout their structure, but again, even those companies may not be fully able to capture these gains. So it's going to take time.
I think the issue of consumer surplus is a great one, on how we measure our digital economy and try not to leave it so stuck in the world of manufacturing. I feel like maybe you're referencing a great MIT study that they did on consumer surplus, which found that they tried to basically ask everyone, if we had to pay you to not use services that we considered to be free, and establish kind of, try and put a value on what these services were. I think they found that Google Maps was the one that most people were like really reluctant to let go of. And I have to say, I think I agree with that one. I would be hopeless and lost and probably not here today without it. I just want to move on to our final topic before we have Andrew from the OECD come up and make some concluding thoughts before we then have a Q&A from the audience. So I think now is time to start thinking about your questions. I think you can submit them through Bcast as well, but if you can't, just wave at me and I'll try and get around to a few people. But I wanted to kind of finish up a little bit on this issue of trust as we move into a digital economy, because, you know, we're sitting in Europe where we've just had a massive change in the way we view data privacy and our rights in a digital economy. And it creates a lot, you know, having these companies work, and the ones you've described as we've gone through this kind of past 40 minutes or so, really rely on gathering a lot of data, being able to share that between other companies. You know, even the UK example of having your vehicle registration, being able to go to HMRC and get that data and having that move around. This creates a lot of problems for governments. You know, they want to ensure that the tech companies are in their countries, are growing, are bringing in tax revenue, but there's also a sense from the people who, I think many groups from the public are kind of becoming aware a little bit late as to what they were giving away in terms of data, becoming aware of their concerns behind, but it doesn't mean those concerns aren't valid. I'm getting a lot of nods, and I'm going to...
Yeah, I'm not really sure that anybody's late for anything. I mean, this revolution has started quite, you know, very, very, very short time ago. So, I mean, and we are going to be living with that. I indeed see a movement of the pendulum from, who cares? I don't mind if they're looking at my data. I have nothing to hide. To why? They should share a little bit with me. They are not powerful. They are not reliable. They're not trustful. So the pendulum is moving. But, you know, I think there will be, I think if one of the main characteristics of the companies that will succeed in the digital world is their capacity of transformation and to adapt. And we are seeing a lot, you know, a very strong adaptation to that. Starting from, you know, Mr. Zuckerberg saying, no, we've done something wrong, and maybe we need some regulation, which is something just inconceivable 2 years ago or 1 year ago, you know, the capacity that companies like Google have put, you know, a whole dashboard with your options for privacy. I mean, or our proposition in terms of telecommunications saying, you know, we want to be the keepers of your privacy because we've been dealing with it for the last 90 years and nothing happens. And that's another proposition. All of them are legitimate, but clearly this is an issue where, you know, in the most advanced and developed countries, you know, there's some conscience being growing, but I don't think we are late. I think we will adapt, and you know, pieces will fit again, quite nicely.
Rory and then Richard.
So, I mean, I agree with the spirit of the question, and I agree with what Enrico just said. This is, you know, it's definitely an evolving area for companies like mine. And I think, frankly, for companies like Enrique's as well, you know, the issue of trust is absolutely critical. You know, when consumers have alternatives, which they do, and they stop trusting your products, then your company is at risk. So it's something that we have to take extremely seriously. It's been an evolving process. I think GDPR is a way station for us in our evolution. It's certainly one thing that's gone along with that is that we have put our company privacy policy in plain, very plain, easy to read language. There are videos. You can absolutely clearly understand exactly what we do with data. And for us, the three critical issues are choice, transparency, and control. And so if you can actually choose when to share, if you can have, I mean, we have this thing called My Activity. So if you go into My Activity, you can actually see every data point that we have collected. And, you know, so you know what we can see, and you know, that gives you an opportunity. There's another function called privacy checkup that basically you can, this is the control element, you can determine how much you want to share and how much you don't. Now, there are benefits to sharing. The point about giving us access to certain forms of data is that we can tailor products to you. So, and that is beneficial in various ways. We can give you more useful information. But if you don't want to give it to us because you don't trust us, then you don't have to. So that is the kind of control that we think users need and want, and that's the way we can serve them best. But you know, it is absolutely an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing, you know, I think that people are growing more aware of this issue, and you know, we as a company will evolve with them.
I mean, the trust issue isn't about the tech industry. I mean, let's be clear. If you look on the most trust measures, there's been falling trust in media, there's been falling trust in politicians, there's been falling trust in large companies, there's been falling trust. Millennials, for instance, will go and read peer-reviewed papers before they follow the advice they get from their doctor, because they no longer trust the doctor necessarily is up to speed. Maybe, given what we heard earlier, they may be right on that. But you know, this is a society-wide problem: is that trust levels in many institutions are falling. And part of that is about technology, and part of it is about transparency that's coming from the press, and a lot of other things. But we also have this paradox that, you know, in a world where trust levels are falling, I'm prepared to have a total stranger stay in my house, leave the keys under the doormat. I've never met them. I'm happy for them to stay in the house because they have a good Airbnb rating. So we get this sort of this other paradox where trust levels are whizzing up. So we've got to spend time as a society understanding how we do this. And I think Enrique's absolutely right. We are very early days on this. You know, it took us a long time to work out the protocols for how vehicle cars worked. You know, we spent time thinking about it, the signaling and all of that, and we are at early days in terms of this stuff, and we've got to learn how to do this. And this is also true of governments. You know, the example I gave earlier on how governments pulled data from different databases, they didn't actually pull the data. What they did is they sent a question in, and they got an answer back saying whether it was true or not. And there were ways of establishing it so that the data sit that there. Now, I think we've got to find ways of developing these protocols, but what I think is really important is that we get, you know, the likes of Google to come up with their idea on how to do it. Because the worst thing for us would be to have a set of politicians write a set of rules here. People who really don't understand. I mean, you watch the Facebook Mark Zuckerberg testimony. You know, there are a group of people who really don't understand this. The idea somehow they're going to be regulating some of these rules on trust, I think, could be a disaster.
But
so
not everyone
I
finds
love
that very
the idea
comforting
of, you know,
on the
the
other
Google
side.
approach is, you know, here's our approach. You know, tell us how we can do it better. And I think that's how we need to do that going forward.
Nick, I have a question for you, actually, because I want to go back to Rory's point on choice and the idea that, you know, companies can have that choice, but when it comes to something like GDPR, people are much more willing to say, yes, I accept on a company that is very established, that is very large, that you struggle to find a way around, and rather than maybe a new small company as someone who works in startups. I'm interested to know what your experience of that is.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting when we talk about trust in this space, it sits across two spaces. It's trust in the technology, so that idea, do I trust the technology is secure? Do I trust the automatic car is going to be safe? Trust in technology to function right is one question. But more deeply and truly, I guess, intrinsic to this conversation is trust in companies, trust in authority, trust in people. So this isn't a question of technology. It is actually about people and frameworks, and that's where the government and the policy piece fits into that. Whether or not people are willing to trust that people are doing the right thing. You know, Rory's point about choice and transparency and control, the piece that's missing there for some people is empowerment. So when we talk about data, are we talking about the choice to control what level of privacy I have over my data, or the empowerment for me to choose to make money off my data instead of another big company making money off my data? We've got a small company who's trying to look at this very issue as a startup, but their question, to your point, is can people get over that unknown to trust them over the big brands that they know, the well-established authorities in a market? So building reputation is still such a huge part of business in this transformative period, and making sure that we have a conversation that enables people to make those informed decisions when they're dealing with a small company, with, you know, the SME that's sending them garden seeds from China. Why do they trust them versus their local garden store? Because they trust Amazon is going to deliver it for them, because it's sitting in a large framework of trust around that. You know, these are the sorts of the pieces that can enable individuals and smaller companies that are emerging to build trust when they sit in a bigger system that has established trust. When we break that trust, though, and when we see those larger players, the big tech companies, leaving people feeling a sense that that trust has been broken, as we saw in the case of Facebook, that's when everybody is affected. And I know that everyone I talk to at Google, at LinkedIn, they are saying, what's happened at Facebook is affecting our company and the way that, you know, people interact with us, because it's a systems question more than it is an individual.
Hey, it's affecting media companies too. On that note, I'm going to invite Andrew up, and then we'll give everyone a chance to round it up before we're done. Andrew, from the OECD, Director of Science, Technology and Innovation, is going to offer some, I guess, policy thoughts for us.
Okay. So it's a pleasure to listen to this distinguished panel with a lot of good ideas and a lot of things we hadn't thought about here at the OECD. I'm in the directorate that's coordinating a really large project that basically is looking at this whole issue for going from analog to digital, called Going Digital, and we're using most of the OECD to help us think about it. But at the bottom of the day, what we really care about, and what was the DNA of my directorate, Science, Technology, Innovation, is productivity gains. That's really what we've been talking about. No one really cares about science per se or technology, but how it can improve our lives. And standard of living is a big part of that, and productivity gives us this. But there is this paradox. I'm not going to let you get away from this. Everyone's talking about it. We're doing it today, but we don't see it in the numbers, even after you correct for some of the mismeasurement, and we've done that here. And partly it's what I think a lot of you have been saying, I think Richard most vocally, that there's big parts of the economy that drive the denominator, education, health, and government itself, that are really slow to get on with this. And so there's some good questions. Why is that? And how do we improve productivity, particularly in those sectors? Because as Jonathan says, it's everything now. It's not just the tech sector like it was earlier. And so let me quickly tick off some of the things that have been said, but I think really resonated with me, and I'm mindful of time because we want to get to the audience. You know, Rory said, you know, avoid well-intentioned but ill-thought-through policies that may act as barriers, and that's exactly right. He also brought up the whole idea about there's a lot of angst out there. People don't like change. That's the fundamental bottom line, particularly those of us who are comfortable in what we're doing already, and that goes for individuals and for firms. So you need a safety net. And when they don't have that, people will resist it. And so getting towards that and rethinking it in time of a digital era, I think, is one of the priorities for a lot of governments. We were talking about low-performing firms, and I love the question put to the audience. And basically, it's evenly split between resource reallocation, and let me tell you, that's a buzzword for leaving, exiting the economy, and hopefully having those resources reallocated and coming back, what Schumpeter would have called creative destruction. And are governments and policymakers really willing to do that? And I think it's important, but doing it is a different thing. We need to strengthen the competitive environment, and there's a question whether that needs to be rethought through for the new ways businesses make money in the digital era, particularly where data is a fundamental part of their whole factor of production. And I think competition authorities and policymakers in general don't get how important data is and what it means for redoing and making a much more competitive company. We talked about the cloud, and I was happy. I think Rory brought this up. It has tremendous potential to bring on board not only governments but SMEs. And so one idea is to maybe use procurement processes to change the way the cloud is, because there's some resistance to adopting the cloud, partly because people don't want to give up their data. They're fearful of lock-in and some of these other things, and they don't get the benefits. And so I think government procurement can help work around that. We talked a lot about how some companies get it and others don't, but I want to talk about how some countries get it and some countries don't. And one of the things I'm observing in our work is what I would call leapfrog, that a country that isn't encumbered with a lot of policies or areas or a lot of laws in one area already can actually make the leap in some ways easier than OECD governments. For example, you look at the digital ID in India. It had some issues, but right or wrong, it is transformative and allowed a much more targeted and efficient way of running that government than what preceded it. Nicola and others talked a lot about complementary investment, meaning it's not just the tech, it's other things that come with it, skills, organizational change, and diffusion. And that's really where I want to end, is why is diffusion so slow? And to me, this is a real head scratcher. And I want to put out one issue is, yeah, there's the usual explanations. It takes time. We've all read about the electronic dynamo and how long it took to transform factories and so forth. I get that. But one thing I want to say is a lot of the technologies driving this, software, for example, data itself, are under intellectual property regimes. And so that retards, or at least forces licensing and royalties to be paid in a way that we haven't seen in earlier tech waves, where this stuff diffused much more quickly. People just adopted new ideas and took them. Now, to do that, in some cases, you'll be violating intellectual property rights, which are well enforced, and for good reason. They incentivize innovation. Let me just end with trust is a barrier, and I don't know if we resolve this one, but it's clear this is fundamental for getting productivity to go, because this is what will help diffusion, is when people begin to see that by adopting these technologies, it will help engender trust in their company or in their government or anything else. Thank you very much.
I think I have 2 more minutes for any audience questions or some of the questions that have been coming through on here. They seem to be based on either this issue of privacy, again, obviously a big topic this week in Europe, or around the other point we've been talking about a lot is this digital divide in terms of who is responsible for ensuring that when we have this transformation, that it is inclusive, and is it organizations like the OECD, is it governments, is it the companies themselves who are all kind of trying to deal internally with so many challenges and so many other issues that even as we have this conversation, it's very easy to go back to thinking about people who already have access, and kind of we have to remind ourselves to think about the people who don't have access at all, so can't get those basic services that are already online. Then I'll ask everyone just to wrap up with a final thought. I'm going to let you pick whether it's about privacy or the digital divide. We'll just go down the line. Jonathan.
I was actually going to do a policy question.
You can do a policy question.
We had been talking before about what could countries do to push the process forward. So if I may, I'd like to skip yours and answer that question in the following way. Companies and countries learn, but they only learn if they study what's going on. In 1982, the United States happened to be chairing the Trade Committee, and the American dropped a self-study of trade and services on the table, which caused a good deal of questioning because nobody was really expecting it, and everybody had to read it. And the result was that through the GATT, which then existed, and through OECD, a process was started to do self-studies of national economies. And it caused a lot of countries to change their minds, not because the United States was saying you should do this or you should do that, because all they were asked to do was study it themselves, study their own economies. And France, for instance, hadn't figured out before they did their self-study that they were the largest beneficiary on trade and services around because of tourism. Everybody wanted to come to France. They still want to come to France. And all of a sudden, free trade and services, which they had opposed, became an issue that said, oh, maybe we should talk about this. So self-study, I think, self-studies of these issues. And the OECD is a perfect position to get its members to actually do self-studies would be a major benefit.
Sounds like a pitch for more academics, Jonathan.
Well, it's a pitch for OECD.
So I'd like to touch on the digital divide question and what are some of the things that we can do to address this. And in doing so, let's talk about the digital divide both from an infrastructure perspective, but also from a skills and a mindset perspective. So digital divide and infrastructure is obviously a role for government investment, but also for working very closely with the private sector to look at actually how do we think of new ways of not just replicating the way we've rolled out infrastructure for technology in one country, but thinking about what are the new ways we can get access in other countries. And balloons in Peru is a great example of this. If we think, though, about skills and the digital divide in the skills space, and this is obviously one that we talk a lot about in terms of female participation in technology and in STEM, but also in underrepresented minorities who are not accessing the opportunities in this space, we need to be thinking not just about how do we embed STEM skills in this part of our population, but how do we also think about the way that we inspire individuals to see how those skills, coupled with that broader skill set that we talked about earlier, can enable people to create real change and to participate in new ways. And finally, that culture piece is about how do we take every generation on this journey with us, and how do we take people who are not all the same. So there isn't going to be one policy that is going to apply for every individual and for every community and for every nation state across any of those areas, infrastructure, skills, or cultural mindset. There is going to need to be a recognition that we're dealing with very, very disparate communities and individuals around the world who have different barriers to actually engaging and being part of the digital transformation that is taking place. We need to understand and deeply go into the implications of what it looks like to put in place a great education system in France or in Australia or in the US versus what it looks like to put in place a great education system enabling skills for a very different future in countries that haven't even got running water and where kids are not going to school because of the threat of death and violence. So these are the deeper questions that we need to be thinking about in the policy setting so we don't just end up working at that space that sits above the top of the iceberg, but instead goes down and is truly inclusive across our society.
I think it's an important point, not just thinking about older workers who maybe don't update their skills, but also the fact that youth unemployment is very high in many, many countries, and obviously sitting in Europe, that's a pertinent point. Rory?
So first of all, I want to congratulate the OECD on their work in this area, which is really, I mean, I think it's path-breaking both in the way that they are building out a common knowledge set and thinking really hard and in a both like academically rigorous but also policy relevant way about the challenges that are created by the digital economy. So, I mean, I think that Andy's summary of this conversation was really exemplary of how good they are on these issues. To the policy points and the issues you've raised, I've said a bit about privacy, so let me just come back to the digital divide. I mean, there's two dimensions to this. I mean, in addition to the distinctions that Nicola just drew between the sort of emerging, developing economy versus the advanced economy, you can think of the divide in access to the digital economy, which is incredibly important, and I think Nicola summarized a lot of the issues extremely well. And then there's a second issue, which is societal divisions that one way or another are caused by digitalization, that some people just are benefiting economically while others are not, or are feeling left behind or actually left behind by that. And you know, so there is a digital response to that, which is like going out, getting people more in line, giving people the skills they need. But then there's a non-digital component, and it is absolutely incumbent upon governments and public policy to think hard about maintaining, you know, a strong, inclusive society and having institutions of redistribution, social safety nets, and so on that don't make people feel that they are on the losing end of some deal, that there are a tiny number of people benefiting and running away with rents produced by the digital economy. That is extremely corrosive to all of us and dangerous to the democratic system, dangerous to, frankly, to the free market system. And so it is absolutely critical that, you know, as this process continues, that we bear in mind that not everyone is going to be economically included, and we find ways of bringing them along too.
Richard, you have 1 minute each. Sorry to make you be so brief, but just your final thoughts before we wrap up.
No, for me it's not a problem. I think I talked about how we tackle the issue of divide from you know, an infrastructure point of view, and how important it is for us, where, you know, more than half of our customer base is in Latin America, and we really feel the responsibility. It's funny, but you know, sometimes we get a stronger demand to have everybody connected, that as we feel that everybody has access to water. That is the important challenge and responsibility that companies like mine are facing today. We are trying to do everything we can and focusing our innovation efforts on that, because for products and services there are others doing great things, and maybe we can learn from them. But it's clear that we have that responsibility on our shoulders, and we will bear with it and respond to societies and the countries in which we work.
So I'm just going to go back to Andrew's thing about diffusion and best practice, and I think we have that problem on productivity, we have it about the SME sector, we have it about the government sector, we have it about how to address the digital divide. We have a diffusion problem around the world in terms of that. And I would sort of, you know, I'm from McKinsey, so we believe that anything that gets measured can be managed better. And I think the OECD has shown that. You know, people around the world will, when you think about the OECD, they will talk about PISA. PISA actually resulted in better management of education systems around the world. There was an example came out of Peru when they were looking at how they did. They were about to come bottom. They said, look, it's unacceptable for us to be bottom. We can't beat Brazil in football, but we can beat them in PISA. And that was their target in their education department, to be able to go after that. So I think that actually we should throw a little bit of this back to the OECD and say, look, you've done PISA on education. Why don't you do that on the digital divide? Why don't you do it on SME productivity? Why don't you do it on government productivity, et cetera, et cetera? So let's find a way of getting some of that power of the measurement system. And I know it's hard. I know when we were doing PISA, I'm sure a lot of countries didn't want you to do PISA. But, you know, the question is, could you do something like that? You got over it with PISA. Could you try and do something else like that in terms of pushing some of these things out? Because if you could establish a PISA-type measurement system for inequality, gender inequality, digital divide or whatever, governments would sit up and take notice, and they would probably take notice a bit more than they do on some of the other reports you produce.
On that great note, we're going to wrap up. Thank you to my panelists, Jonathan, Nicola, Rory, Enrique, and Richard, and of course, Andrew, for wrapping up. And everyone, you are free to enjoy your evenings. Thank you.
So much.
Oh, it was, it needed refreshing. So it took me a while to realize I needed to keep refreshing it.
Oh, it's okay.
But I realized and I eventually managed to see what it said. Thank you so much.
And the mic. I am freezing today.
Yeah, it's cold, isn't it? It got colder and colder. Yeah.
Yep.
For tomorrow, so I'll stick them in my bag.
Yeah.
That way we lose them overnight. I think we have some work to do to get the room set up for tomorrow.
I would just step outside for 2 minutes. so I
Yeah,
heat up
let's
my
take a
life.
little break. It's freezing, isn't it? Freezing. Great, thank you. Oh, I did a great job, didn't I? I mean, she didn't do the Q&A, but she did. Oops.
Yep.
This.
And you already want to put the
It would be nice
tablets
to
back?
go check them in right now, so I don't have to keep track of them.
They plan to come in 10 minutes, I think. At 6:30.